was a Canadian poet who wrote, "The guns are now forever stilled, and blood will never flow again in Flanders fields." The year was 1936, and thousands of Canadians had journeyed to the unveiling of the monument at Vimy Ridge in Flanders fields to honor their fellows who had died in the First, and as the poet thought, the last World War. But at that precise moment, Italy's dictator had donned the garb of a general. At that moment, the Emperor of Japan was proudly reviewing troops who had already done battle for the greater glory of the homeland. And in a swiftly rearming Germany, the Nazis were training bully boys in the use of the truncheon to quell the last remnants of opposition to the new regime. There was violence on the streets of Berlin, rioting on the boulevards of Paris, social conflicts which in Spain had already erupted into civil war. In Canada, as almost everywhere, massive unemployment. In America, in Britain, the indignity of the soup kitchen and bread line. But in Germany, millions of people had by now been persuaded that they had the answer to all their problems. It meant the end of democratic processes in Germany, and it meant unthinking obedience to a dictator. But though the problems of unemployment and stagnation affected Europe and America alike, he had persuaded his followers that Germany's troubles were unique. To solve them, all they had to do was get back the territories taken from them by the Treaty of Versailles. And there were many, even outside Germany, who agreed that Versailles had indeed been a vindictive settlement. But they were soon to have second thoughts. In March 1938, the Nazi columns crossed the frontier of an Austria which had never been part of Germany. A triumphant Hitler rode into Vienna. Through subversion and threat, Hitler had found that he could win victories without battle. For who would dare set off a war that could mean the end of civilization? Within Germany, all opposition to the Nazis had been destroyed or silenced. They had built up a vast mechanized army. They had 4 million men in uniform. They were ready for modern warfare, on land, in the air, at sea. And their leaders had just signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. September the 1st, 1939, they drove into Poland. This time, it was war. Poland had armed 2 million men. But in the face of this new kind of war, blitzkrieg, the Poles were helpless. 1 million died or were captured. It was all over in just 1 month. It couldn't happen to France, of course. The motorized columns of the Germans could never penetrate the traps of the Maginot Line. Though France, Britain, and the Dominions were now formally at war with Germany, it looked as if it could only end in a stalemate. But what couldn't be passed through could be passed over and got around. For the second time in 25 years, the roads of northern France were choked with refugees. The French had said, "It will never happen again." The Nazis sang, "Today, Germany, tomorrow, the whole world." The remnants of the Allied troops headed for Dunkirk and rescue. The middle of June, the Germans entered Paris. Almost 500,000 Parisians had died in the 4 agonizing years of the First World War to keep the invader from their city. This time, an unbelievable 6 weeks had brought the conqueror to the heart of France. Mussolini declared war. It was written of this scene, their execution was announced and they cheered. But it wasn't utter madness. Hitler had demonstrated that with blitzkrieg, vast and easy victories were possible. Almost all of Europe was now in the hands of the Axis, or neutral. There remained only the island of Britain. Many neutral experts estimated Britain will be knocked out in 4 weeks. The Luftwaffe had almost 3,000 heavy bombers ready for action. To repel the attack they knew could come any moment, Britain had just 59 fighter squadrons. It began in August, with dogfights over the Channel. The strategy of the Luftwaffe's commander, Goering, was simple. Knock out London, and you've knocked out England. September 6th, 500 bombers, wave on wave, headed for the city. Every critical day that followed, the newspapers tallied up the scores of wins and losses, like a deadly game whose issue was survival itself. Every weary night that followed, the Londoners fought the firebombs that were meant to reduce the greatest city in the world to a smoldering heap. The Nazis called it Krieg der Schrecklichkeit, war of terror, that would destroy the people's will to resist. But fear and exhaustion were overridden by simple anger at those who would destroy indiscriminately, whose military objectives included anybody and everybody. And to the amazement of the prophets of lightning doom, the outnumbered British forces shot almost 3,000 Nazi planes out of the sky in 2 months. The Battle of Britain was too costly. It was obviously going to take the Axis powers somewhat longer to achieve total victory. Total victory, in Hitler's long-range plan, included enslavement of the Soviet Union. It was June 1941. In just 3 pillaging months, they raced to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. By now, too, the manipulators of the Japanese war machine had become obsessed with the vision of the knockout punch, the sudden sweeping blow, instant victory. Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, they came without warning. By 8 a.m. at Pearl Harbor, almost half the American Pacific Fleet was crippled or sunk.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Nothing could stop the secret, long-planned drive to engulf the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, the islands of the Pacific. They were to sweep into captivity or oblivion the Canadians in Hong Kong, the British in Singapore. They had subdued 1/10 of the population of the world. The wealth of the Indies was in their grasp, and it too had taken just 3 months. Victory for the Axis powers was at hand. west, Hitler's troops occupied almost every capital from Oslo to Athens. Japan had a stranglehold in the east, in the Pacific. It was just a question of filling in the blanks. Hitler was in a position to tell his admirers that their empire in Europe would last 1,000 years. The Germans, the master race, all others, their slaves. The systematic machinery of enslavement was already at work under the notorious Himmler. Nazi leaders had already consigned millions of Europeans, mostly Jewish, to slave labor or death in the gas chambers. Hitler was now fond of the expression Fortress Europe. It was a fortress with many unsuspected dungeons, but only their jailers need know about them, for the fortress was impregnable. August 1942, a plan to send Canadian and British troops, restless for action, to see if the defenses were all that good at Dieppe. It was planned to be a quick jab, a reconnaissance, and retreat to safety. Within 12 hours, the men from Vancouver and Toronto and St. John had exchanged the boredom of the parade grounds of England for the desolation of German prison camps. The day when an attack on the fortress might succeed was far off. There were some who doubted the day would ever come, for despite its great navy, the island of Britain was now in deadly danger. The island couldn't live without food and supplies brought through the lifeline by sea from North America. Churchill said later, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. By day, they lurked undetectable in the depths. At nightfall, they surfaced, and the merchant seaman was a sitting duck." In one night, out of a convoy of 22 ships bound for Britain, 10 were sunk at the cost of one U-boat. Total war had become a struggle affecting everyone, painfully, heroically, tediously. Everybody carried a ration card. And in Toronto or London or Berlin, shopping became an exercise in arithmetic. In Winnipeg or Washington, every school child was a scrap gatherer. Rubber, oil, steel, the sinews of war. Canada, traditionally a supplier of raw materials, had become in 3 years a great industrial power, turning out the essentials of total war. Canada had started almost from scratch. All the Allies had started late, but for the first time it looked as if it would not be too late, if they could get the supplies to where they were needed. From the eastern ports, the cargo vessels were being cleared in convoy for the run to Britain or Russia. But by now the Nazis had doubled the number of U-boats waiting for their prey. By November 1942, they were picking off an average of 4 precious cargoes every day. Yet these perilous days and nights have been described as the turn of the tide for the Allies. For despite all the terrible losses, the bulk of the stuff was getting through. "There is no doubt now," said Churchill, of the eventual outcome. Food and arms for Britain, trucks, tanks for the Soviet Union. The hitherto victorious Rommel in Africa now faced a British general whose troops were evenly matched in firepower. The almost unbroken series of defeats and retreats for the Allies was over. It was British soldiers who were now on the offensive in the deserts of Libya. It was American craft that carried the GIs to the steaming jungles of the Pacific Islands. And in the Soviet Union, the most critical battle of all was approaching its climax. For months, the Nazis and Russians had struggled over the key city of Stalingrad. The order on both sides was fight to the death. In January, 2 Soviet armies were to meet in a vast pincer movement around it. 100,000 Germans had been killed, another 100,000 were captured. Some must have wondered what they were doing so far from where they belonged, for the news from home was bad. Their beloved homeland was now being systematically pounded. Before the war's end, more explosives were to be dropped on Germany than were used in all of the First World War. They aimed to disrupt communications and transport. They aimed to knock out German industry. But the time of the knockout punch, the sudden, decisive, massive victory, was long past. Night after night, the Lancasters flew. It was British and Canadian hands which were on the bomb releases now. Though the fortress was shaken and cities in flames, so strong remained the grasp of the Nazi war machine that the Allies didn't risk a frontal assault until June 6, 1944, D-Day. It took 5,000 vessels to carry them all. Ahead, the fortified and mined beaches of France. The first 4 days, it was touch and go. Casualties were enormous. But the beachhead had been firmly won. The armor rolled into France. Hitler was caught with war on 2 fronts. Yet it is reported that in this seemingly desperate fix, Hitler was exultant. His secret weapon, the unmanned plane, was at last unleashed to finally crush the people of England. If that didn't do it, his rockets would. For the weary people at whom they were aimed, the rockets were almost too much. A fight's a fight, a man has a chance, but these things crashing in out of nowhere to kill thousands. This was a new kind of war, with a totally inhuman dimension. But for Hitler, it was too late. As the Allies swept north towards Belgium, they overran the launching sites. The outcome would be determined not by frightful new secret weapons, but by the old war pattern of combat and capture. By the crude reality of man against man, weapon against soldier, the imperative of traditional war, kill or be killed. But as always, total war was no respecter of persons. In their retreat, the Germans had flooded the lowlands of Holland, and it was ordinary people who had no particular quarrel with anybody, whose homes were destroyed, whose children were sick and hungry. But it would soon be over. Though there had been dangerous moments for the Allies, those who had once thrilled to the glorious promises of the leader were now being rounded up like cattle. In France, the collaborators who had gambled that Hitler would inevitably win and reward them were meeting the pent-up hatred and contempt of their fellow countrymen. In Italy, a deceived and outraged people hanged their great leader in a public square in Milan. The empire, which was to last 1,000 years, had been shrunk to a sliver in 3. 10 years earlier, Hitler had said, "Whoever lights the torch of war in Europe can wish for nothing but chaos." Chaos for others, of course. It was a threat. But now, in the last days, utter chaos for Germany itself. Perhaps most curious of all is the fact that after all the years of destruction and devastation, after all the devotion to duty and heroism and sacrifice, nobody had really won anything. Everybody was a loser. So many Germans had died or been captured that the astonished Allied troops mopping up in Germany often found schoolboys in uniform left to hold the fort. And to their horror, the Allies also ran across the death camps in which millions had perished, their crime not belonging to the master race. The long struggle in Europe was over. On VE Day, the Allies had much to celebrate. They had not been finally enslaved. That was the victory. And there remained only one enemy not subdued. On August the 6th, 1945, a single plane over Japan carried a package about a yard long that would change the dimensions of war forever. 100,000 people who had sat down to breakfast that morning no longer existed. The city of Hiroshima no longer existed. From that morning on, men would have to live with the ghastly knowledge that war, pushed to its ultimate, spares nobody. Not so long ago, war was thought of as only the proper and gallant business of professional soldiers. Now it touches all of humanity. Yet under the shadow of this cloud, there was some hope. Even before the war ended, statesmen had resolved that they must build a place of meeting. The United Nations was meant to be a place where men could iron out their differences and resolve their conflicts somewhere short of that unimaginable war which must never come.